we will be talking about, this is basically using an expert system where we use an experiment, an expert panel, to actually come up with a weighting system for the different, basically, analytics, for the different business rules. Okay? The idea here is that most of the time you have expert systems, they would identify exceptions that are based on violation of certain rule. Okay? Like exceeding credit limit. It would be a violation of the rule. It would be highlighted as an exception. This is where you would actually get a lot of exceptions. This is where the system is likely, and like with Siemens, you are likely to have hundreds, if not thousands, of exceptions because of all these issues that would happen, such as exceeding the limit, missing values, missing information, etc. And usually the way it happens right now with audits is that they take samples. Rather than doing that, we developed here a rule-based system that would identify all the exceptions, and then it would rank them in order of suspicion. This idea is similar to spam. You know spam, how it happens with, how does Gmail, for example, mark a certain email as spam? Do you know how this happens? It looks at certain criteria or at certain characteristics of your email. For example, if the email comes from someone with the same domain name as your email, for example, at Rutgers.edu. If you receive an email from someone who has at Rutgers.edu, this email is more likely to be safe, right? If you receive an email with the word Viagra in it, so what happens at that point? Gmail would give it a very negative score. It would give it, for example, a score of -1000. If this email comes from the chair of your department, who always sends you emails, or from your advisor, who always sends you emails, it will automatically give it a positive value. So for example, you received an email talking about Viagra from someone in your department. It could be that you're doing a study. Let's say that you're not an accounting student. You are, for example, you are more or less like, I don't know, a medical student, and you're receiving those emails. So at that point, Gmail would give it as -1000 for Viagra, +200. It will send it to spam, right? What can you do to fix that? You add that person to safe list. At that point, Google will also give it, for example, +10,000. At this point, the number is positive, and it will go through. So this way of looking at which ones are sent to spam and which ones pass the test was the idea behind using a suspicion score. Here what we're saying is that those transactions and records that you have, we are going to examine the whole population. We test all this population, all these transactions against this expert system. Any case that violates at least one rule is considered as an exception, right? For example, if that one had an unauthorized shipment, or there was a segregation of duty, that will automatically be highlighted as an exception. The problem is that in many cases you will have plenty of these. You will have an alarm flood. How do you deal with that? We thought about using the same method. Give them a suspicion score based on the weight of each rule that they violate. Now the second idea was that second thing was that these rules are not always the same in that they don't always have the same weight. For example, a password that is a generic password does not have the same severity if the user was a regular user or a super user. It's not the same level of riskness. We started off with 33 analytics, and then we asked, because 33 analytics, those are the mostly used ones in the auditing profession right now. Because of time limitations of the experiment, we could not run the experiment using the 33 analytics. Instead, we wanted to see how we can get those weights. So what we did, we asked a group of experienced auditors to pick the 15 riskiest ones. Just pick the 15 that, in their opinion, based on their experience, they are the riskiest. We ended up with 12 that had 75% of the, basically 75% agreement of those group of people. So we ended up with 12 analytics. Those are the 12 analytics here. Then the next idea was that, okay, so let's say that a rule, a transaction, this transaction here, record 1001, violated SOD customers for sales order and violated matching shipping docs to sales order. So you have matching shipping docs to sales orders, and we have SOD. At that point, the suspicion score will be the weight of each violated rule. So it will be, you add this one and this one. This is 191 plus 1. Then we did the same thing, we repeated the same thing to all the transactions. So if a case has a suspicion score of 0, what does it mean? It did not violate any rules. So that is not even an exception. It gets a score of 0. Looking at those ones, you look and you see that this is the highest one. This one here, I'm sorry, 8.43. So this will be ranked as 1. This is the most suspicious case. So although you have all these cases, which ones are you going to look at first? This is the framework of the study. I personally prefer this one. It looks nicer. But I was told that it's not too academic. So we cannot have Sherlock Holmes apparently looking at our rule-based system. So let's go back to this one, the dull one. So basically here you have the rule-based system is extracted. Rule-based systems are simply a set of if-then rules. So for example, if a certain transaction, the amount exceeds the credit limit, then flag that one. Then that one would be an exception. It's rule-based systems are if-then. We have the rule-based system. The rules are derived from domain experts. This is the analytics that we use in our study, which are based on what auditors use today when they audit their clients. We apply this one, the rule-based system, and we use archived data to get those rules. Now, we used an experiment. We conducted an experiment where the participants were senior auditors, and they were asked to rank those rules to see which ones have the weight. So we wanted to get the weights. However, based on the social sciences literature, you know that humans are not good at aggregating information. So if you ask them to basically rank 12 or 15 analytics, they are not going to be able to do that. So what did we do? Instead of doing that, we wanted to emulate real life. And what happens in real life? They actually see transactions, and then they have to find out what the violated rule was, right? They are not actually told that, okay, so this transaction violates segregation of duty. They will see that the same person started and approved that transaction. They will have to find out that this one has violated a certain rule. That one, once we have those rules, we applied them to the exceptions that were identified. So those were running in parallel. The expert panel, those are senior auditors, 28 senior auditors. They provided us with a way to rank, basically not to rank, they provided us with a way to give weights to each violated rule. We used those weights and we added them based on this graph here. We put them for each record, for each exception. That would give us what? The suspicion score. Because at that point, you use those records to calculate the suspicion score of each case. This is what we mean here by exception prioritization. We ranked those exceptions based on their suspicion score. Suspicion score is simply the weight of all the rules that they have violated. Once we had that one, we provide, this information would go for investigation. Based on time and budget limitations, the auditors will examine a certain amount of exceptions. Those are, of course, let's say if they only can examine 20 cases, they are advised to, they are recommended to pick the ones with the 20th, basically with the highest suspicion scores. If one of them has a suspicion score of like this one here, of 8, they, like, let's say if they look at those two and they need to only look at 2 cases, which ones would they are basically more likely to look at? The 8.43 and the 4.94. So if you think about it like Gmail, again, which one is Gmail going to place in spam? Is it the one that has a lower score, where you have, for example, all these words and all these like different characters, etc.? Or is it something that was sent by your advisor? If they are going to send one to spam, it's not going to be the one that is by your advisor. So here, you look at all, again, the suspicion score. Go ahead. That would be added. It's here you're looking at the same at one transaction. What do you mean by that? So this is one transaction. You're giving it a score. You're talking here at this point if it is the same user. Let's say it's the same user doing that over and over and over, right? At that point, you would have a different. You would adapt your model to include information on the user. Here you're looking at the individual transactions. Let me show you, for example, of this transaction that we showed the expert panel. Okay, can you guys? No, you can't. How about now? Okay, so this is this one, rather than giving a list of 12 analytics and asking the auditors to simply, those senior auditors, to simply rank them, it would have been very hard to do that. We used linear programming to basically give them different weights. The idea here is that auditors, when they go to a certain location, they would end up with transactions. So in this case, for example, you look at the first transaction here. Oops, sorry. So the first transaction here, and then this one, sorry, it's a little bit annoying. This one, it was created by the same person, the same user who actually approved the shipment document. This is a violation of segregation of duty. And then the second transaction had missing information. It had this missing information here. So it had here, we're missing this information. Now, we're not saying that this transaction is riskier than the others. We are not saying that. We're not saying that there's a right or wrong answer. We're just asking the auditors, pick one that would say, pick which one do you think, in your opinion, presents a higher control risk. And any auditor you ask will tell you immediately that the answer would be what? Segregation of duty. Interestingly enough, when we finished with the model, they ranked the lowest. Now, we had in our expert panel 11 internal auditors and 17 external auditors. We noticed that both of them, they actually ranked segregation of duty low. We don't know why yet. We're still kind of trying to see why. But that was kind of an interesting finding to us. So let's go back here. Let's step back a little bit. Here we talked about the rule-based system, which is simply an if-then rules. You have rules if it violates, if it was, for example, the one before, if it was created by the same user who approved the shipment document, then flag it as an exception. And then we use those weightings from the experiment to using this linear program to give each rule a certain weight. Those are the rules that we ended up using. It is for a simulated order to cash data. Unfortunately, we did not have a real data, so we couldn't test it. Here, we had those 28 participants. They had to go through 17 comparisons. For time limitations, you cannot go with each possible comparison. Unfortunately, you wouldn't find any participants for your experiments. So we had to limit it as much as possible and to have some kind of ordered, basically a partial order. It's very hard to get the same consensus from all the auditors that, for example, rule 1 is riskier than rule 2, and then rule 2 is riskier than rule 5, and then rule 4, etc. It's very unlikely that you would get that. What we're doing here is that we're thinking in the mind that 2 heads are better than 1. So we're trying to get a partial order. This is why we use linear programming to get the weights of each rule that was here. And here, the rule and analytic are the same that we're talking about. We have 12 rules in this system. The auditors who were participating, the auditors who were participating in this one were actually, so the auditors who were participating in this experiment, what they did was they compared pairs of transactions. And then they ranked each one of them. They would say, for example, so let's say the first transaction is more suspicious. We use this one, or is riskier. At that point, we used linear program model. I'm not showing it here. I can show it to you after class. We had 2 linear program, we had 2 models, a special case model and a general case model. The special case model had only 1 rule was allowed to be violated in each transaction. To make it simpler, that was to make it simpler for them. So they would only take 1 rule into consideration. The second one, we added 1 pair that violated 2 rules. We wanted to see how, in real life, you might have a transaction that has violated multiple rules. How would that affect the model? The idea here, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, yes, that would be the feedback. I think it's after this one. Basically, the feedback from the auditor's investigation should feedback into 2 parts, into the weighting system, so into the linear program, because at that point you have a certainty. You have a certainty to, for example, what that case was actually, whether it was higher or not. So you have this, it will feed back into the into the system here. Let me just give you 1 second. It will feed back into the weighting system, and it will also feed back into the rule-based system itself. So let's say that you had a rule that did not have any weight at that point. Basically, the auditors did not care about, or they found it not risky. So at that point, you remove that rule completely and you include something else instead. Now, this is the suspicion score. It's simply the weight of simply the weight of the rules that were violated. So if it is violated, if this rule was violated, the suspicion score will include its weight. If this rule was violated, its suspicion score will be added. Its weight will be added to the suspicion score. So it will be here basically 1 multiplied by 1, 0 multiplied by 2.58, etc. It will be simply ones and zeros. Once you have all the suspicion scores, you can rank them. Then use after the investigation of those most suspicious cases, you can use that to feed back this information into the weighting system as well as the rule-based system itself. Now, we looked at both, whether there were differences between the special model and the general model. It was interesting to see that most of the time, SOD, or segregation of duty, they ranked low. So this is based on the links. This is based on the rank. As you can see, the most or the riskiest one, according to the special case model, was excessive write-offs. So it seems that the auditors would rank the highest those cases where money is going out of the company directly. Basically, controls that will be affecting the financial situation of the company. Unauthorized sales order, etc. The first 5 here, actually the first 9 were the same. The ones that were different were segregation of duty, and in this case you have the segregation of duty, basically analytic 9 was ranked 7. So although whenever you talk to any auditor, it says that this case will be segregation of duty will be the highest, it's not always the case. So now what I want to see, what I wanted to say from this paper was that simply, okay, I should not have shown this one yet. Now, in most cases, whenever you have a rule-based system which is in the industry that is used, most of the time they use weights that are equal or randomly assigned to each rule. But we know that business rules, they don't have the same weight. What we tried to do in this paper was actually to find a better way when you have all these exceptions that are identified. And based on our experience, you do identify a lot of exceptions. How are you going to deal with them? One way, in our opinion, was to use the suspicion score. The suspicion score is basically based on, it's simply based on the rules that were violated by that specific record. So that transaction violated certain rules. How serious were those rules? The more suspicious the case is, the higher the recommendation for the auditors to look at. So it doesn't mean that those are actually fraudulent transactions. It simply means that those are riskier than others based on the consensus, not necessarily consensus, but based on the values that were derived from an expert panel. Do you have any questions about that? This one? Yes.
So I understand you're using suspicious score, but for instance, let's say one record violate the first one, which is grade 1.0.
Yeah.
And also violate 1.2b. Also violate 1.3.
So it had here one, one.
and third one, fourth one, and then let's say the SOD invoice, which is
This one. Oops. This one. This is SOD invoice shipping.
1.0.
1.0. Okay. 1.0.
Yes. If you add them up, its score is going to be less than 5.
It's 4.
It's 4, around 4.
Yeah.
So let's say the another transaction violates second,
Okay. So this one here, 1.
second, and also let's say 2.81. So it violates, what I'm trying to say is one record violates 4 rules, another record violates 2 rules.
Yes. But which rules are?
Using suspicious score, you're going to use second one
Yes.
instead of first one.
Yes.
For me, you violate 4 rules. One record violates 4 rules, another one violates 2 rules. As an auditor, I'm going to look first one first because it violates 4 rules.
But at the same time, you don't have the same. They don't have. This is assuming that all the rules have the same weight. So it's not all the rules.
No, I'm not talking about the weight.
No, no. That all the if you violate rule 1 and rule 2, it's of the same seriousness. It's not always the same seriousness.
No, what I'm trying to say is you came up with, the 35 rules that we typically use.
Actually, they are not.
Serious one.
Okay. So okay.
You came up with a 12 serious one.
Yes.
So what I'm thinking is that's 12 serious, and if you start with the previous
But you have
rules,
one that is serious, one that is more serious, and one that is most serious.
Well, I think the point is that you limit how suspicion is raised by doing a two-by-two comparison.
What, that was an experiment. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you.
Statistic, which is that you say, how about 4 violations versus this? I mean, that may well rise suspicion,
But-
but you don't elicit that information in your experiment.
But if you say, as soon as you say more violations are, so, but this is the thing. When you go on, when auditors they are not told that you have 4 violations. They will see a transaction which has 4 violations compared to one that has 2 violations. For example, this is based on the experimental design that we have.
You brought design by itself in real life,
here's,
right?
here's what I'm trying, maybe, I was the auditors about 2 years ago. Anyway, we start with general IT general control,
Okay.
and then we do those that check those whether there is rule violations. If you have a more rule violation, we decide that system has high risk.
I agree with you that this is how
Second
it's.
one, so if I do the first one, you do my example, I'm going to decide that has a serious weakness in internal control. But the second one, it has two violations.
But they are riskier rules.
Less.
But they are riskier rules. So for example, one of them is a rule where the username, the password of regular users can be for IT purposes. The user can have the same password for 6 months. That is, for example, a violation of the internal control where it's supposed to be for 3 months only. Is it the same seriousness as having a blank password for a super user? It's
What
not.
I'm trying to say is those 12.
This is not what is done in the real life right now. Right now, what they are doing is, like you said, they think of each violation of a rule as the same as a violation of rule 2 or rule 3. It doesn't matter. It has 3 violations, so it means it is riskier than 2 violations. This is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
What I'm arguing here is that it's not the case. And actually, we talked to IDEA, like a company, IDEA. What they are doing now is that they are trying to assign weights to each rule. So if this transaction, at this point, if this transaction violated this rule, it would have such weight. If it had violated that rule, it would have a different weight. We use an expert panel to come up with those numbers rather than saying that, okay, any transaction will have 1, or this transaction will have weight of 1, this one will have a weight of 2.
If you're using this one, basically you are saying we don't need a risk assessment.
This one?
Yes. That's what I'm thinking. We don't need a risk assessment. We came up with
So those are the ones that if you are limited in time to look at certain things, certain exceptions, then you look at the most suspicious one. Yes, this is what I'm arguing. You had a question? You had a question? Add a what? Yes, that would be for what? The number of rules that were violated. We can do that. Yes, we did not think of it because at that point you are also changing the weights of the rules. Our argument is that even one that violates 2 rules might be more suspicious than a case where it violates 4 rules. This is my argument, that it could be. Why? Because the rules that are violated are more serious than the ones that are violated by the one that violated 4 rules. Although it violated 4, but there were 4 violations, but they are less serious than those ones. Yes? Actually, this is what I did not show. And the business I think this is what you also want. This is the general case model. I added the weights whenever it has two violations, it will be added as violation of rule 1 plus violation of rule 2 for that specific case. We did that for one of the pairs, and there were certain auditors who picked it for one reason, the others who detected the second one, and then we combined that one together. Any questions? So by raise of hands, do you think A, B, C, or D? D, okay. So that's the correct answer, although this is not what I was saying. This is what I was saying, that in general, whenever you are running a continuous auditing system or continuous control monitoring system, you will end up with too many exceptions. This is basically what happens in real life. And most of the time, you have too many exceptions. So what do you end up with? You have information overload. You get frustrated and upset because you don't know what to do with those exceptions. Now, don't be too upset, because on the bright side, what you will have here is you have some research opportunities as far as we are concerned. We have research opportunity in this area. At this point, you can look at ways of prioritizing and ranking those exceptions. Paley, for example, she's using belief functions to prioritize exceptions. I use a panel, an expert panel, in an experimental setting to come up with those weights for the rules. So you have different ways of coming up with rankings of different exceptions. That would help the auditors focus on the more suspicious cases. This is basically was the takeaway from today. Do you have any questions? Okay. Thank you. And